Hey guys, it's Dylan with CT Aquatics, and today we're going to be going through the calcium reactor. A calcium reactor is a dosing method for a reef tank that adds the major elements calcium, alkalinity, and magnesium to the tank. So how it works is we fill up the reactor with a media, and then the media is dissolved with CO2, and then it can be added to the tank that way. So the media in the reactor is generally old coral skeletons or dead coral skeletons. There are different medias that are made synthetically, which is actually what we're using here. These are basically just rocks that are made out of calcium and alkalinity, and we have added an additional one that is made out of magnesium so that the CO2 is able to dissolve it and add a balance of each of the elements to the tank. Dead coral is typically used because when the skeletons of the dead coral dissolves, it dissolves into the minerals that it is made out of, so it will end up adding calcium, alkalinity, magnesium, and other trace elements to the tank that the coral would use to then grow. So you use dead coral to allow your living coral to grow bigger. So this is the reactor itself. The reactor is basically just a large tube that holds the media, and then on the side it has a pump at the bottom along with the CO2 counter. So right here we have our CO2 tank with the regulator. The regulator regulates how much CO2 is being added to the reactor. So how the reactor works is there's a pH probe in the top, and we set the pH in the reactor to a low value, usually around 6.5 or 6.3. We're currently running this at 6.3. As the pH rises, the probe will detect the pH in the reactor, and if it rises above the 6.3, it will add more CO2 to the system, because CO2 will lower the pH. Keeping it at a steady pH will allow the minerals within the coral skeletons to dissolve out at a consistent pace so that we can add that to the tank at a consistent rate. So now that we've gone over and shown you how the calcium reactor works, we're going to go through the calcium reactor setup so that you can get yours working on your own tank. So the calcium reactor that we're going to be assembling today is the Reef Octo Cal React 200. This is going on the main display tank for the ITI lobby. So I've already taken it out of the box and I'm getting it set up now. So out of the box, this is how the calcium reactor looks. I've already started by putting all of the required plumbing on it. So this comes all pre-glued. You just have to add a couple of O-rings, one at the pump, one at the reactor body, another one at the top of the reactor body, and one at the pH probe right at the bottom there. So I've also started by adding the first ball valve and set of tubes. So basically how this is going to work is we'll put a sponge in the bottom here, followed by our calcium media, another sponge, and a divider where our probes and all of the excess CO2 can go. Some other stuff to go along with this build. Here's the foam pads and the divider that goes in the top of the reactor. You'll also need a 5 or 10 pound CO2 tank. This one's not filled yet. We'll have to go and get that filled. We're also using a continuous duty dosing pump like this one from Kamar. This one is designed to be constantly running, and you can use this little dial here to dial in your flow rate anywhere from, I believe, 5 milliliters a minute to up to 100 or 500 milliliters per minute. I have to double check on the actual speed of it. But this is designed to be running constantly, which is perfect for a calcium reactor. Here's the controller for the Varios pump that comes with the reactor, and then we have our carbon doser. So this is going to attach onto our CO2 tank. This acts as an electronic bubble counter. You can adjust your bubble rate with this dial here, and this will feed our calcium reactor with CO2 to dissolve the media. Another quick note, we also have our Neptune Apex pH probe. This is going to be added to our Apex as the controller. I've already gone ahead and added this top piece for our probe holder. There's just a little O-ring in there, if you can see that. and then this will just screw right onto the top of the lid for the controller. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually try and locate where this calcium reactor is going to go. There's not a whole lot of space on this counter, so I think I'm going to just put it over here and end up moving this carbon reactor. So let's start by moving this carbon reactor. Yep, so the calcium reactor is now just sitting right next to the tank, right behind our return pump. So the media that I'm going to be using in this reactor is this aragonite reactor media from Corellian Zuck. I just poured this into a bucket and put some RO water to rinse off any dust. So I'll just start scooping this out and adding it into the reactor. So adding the media to the reactor is simple. We're just going to pull this CO2 line off the top. We're going to unscrew the top. We're going to add in our first foam pad. That down to the bottom, and then I'm just going to start taking handfuls of the media that has been rinsed and adding it into the reactor. Okay, so now that the media has been added in, we just have one bag. We could add in more later on. But now we're going to just continue the setup and start by adding in this top foam piece. This is the separator for the top chamber, so you don't need to put it in super deep because we're going to actually push it down with the divider piece. So I've got this little plastic piece that will sit on top, and actually I've put the foam too low. So you can really fill this up quite a bit with media. And then we'll screw the lid back on. Now that the lid's back on, we can start putting the tubes back together and start the main assembly of this. So whenever the media runs out, he'll replace it by simply removing this lid, pulling the foam out, pulling the top divider out, and adding more media. You also do the same thing for your yearly cleaning. Just take the lid off, then you can reach your hand in nice and deep. So after that, what we'll need to do is get this plumbed up to the tank and to our CO2 regulator. So I'm back and I just got the CO2 tank filled with CO2 at our local gas shop. We want to make sure that the valve stays closed on this while we attach our carbon doser. So the carbon doser is the regulator that we're using on our CO2 tank for the calcium reactor. So I have all of the instructions right here for attaching it to the tank. It's very important that you follow the instructions very closely. So we're going to start by attaching the valve to the end of our CO2 tank, and then we're going to do a bleed test. So I'm going to do that off camera just because I don't have a free hand right now, and then I'll come back as soon as that's done. Okay, so I have the valve added onto my CO2 canister, and I have the pressure valve all the way open. So now to do the bleed test is simple. All you have to do is slowly release the valve open. So I'm going to slowly open it. Until it's all the way open. And now I can see that the PSI is almost at 750. So now that the valve is open, to do a leak test of the solenoid, all we're going to do is close the main valve of the CO2 can again. Once it's all the way closed, I just need to watch the pressure for about 15 minutes, so I'll come back when that's all set. So while I'm waiting for the CO2 portion of this to settle in and do the leak test, I started adding some of the extra tubing. So I put the inlet onto where the CO2 is going to enter into the reactor through the bubble counter. I added the check valve that came with the reactor, and then attached a piece of tubing that came with my CO2 regulator and attached the CO2 regulator's check valve. Having two check valves gives me double the protection against backflow into the CO2 unit. This will also help to keep the CO2 unit's check valve clean. This one is actually, you're able to take it apart and clean it, so the less air that can go through this back will keep this clean for a lot longer. So if this one fails, this one will stop any water from getting back into the CO2 unit, and then again, if this one fails and anything does get into here, I can take this one apart and clean it later on. I also went ahead and added my inlet tube to the pump and put the ball valve attached. So our carbon doser hasn't budged at all in the 15 minutes, which means there's no leaks, so we can now move on to the next step of this process. One quick note to make is the cord that comes with the carbon doser is fairly short. It's only about 3 feet long, so make sure that you locate your CO2 can in an area close to your apex controller or to the plug that it will be plugged into. Okay. So I've attached the airline tubing from the output of the carbon doser, and I just ran it into a little cup of water for a test. I also plugged in the carbon doser. So the valve is currently closed at the top still, but I just want to show you quickly how this works. So you have your pressure in the main chamber of the doser, so that's the pressure in the doser. This valve up here is telling you the pressure coming back from the tank. This little knob here adjusts the size of your bubble, and this little dial right here determines your seconds per bubble. So this is different than a standard doser in which you have to mess around with a bubble counter. It's usually a little clear tube that has a output in it that the CO2 can travel through, and you can actually see the CO2 come out from the bottom of the tube and rise up to the top. However many bubbles you have per second would be your ratio of CO2 being added to the tank. Now this is very handy because with this knob here, it's actually seconds per bubble, and you can probably see that the red light has been flashing once every about 10 seconds. The light flashes every time it allows CO2 through, and the amount of CO2 let through is determined by this valve, which again is your bubble size. So if I turn this dial all the way down to 0.1, that means that every 0.1 seconds you'll get a bubble, which is why it's flashing repeatedly. And then we can come down to our cup and see that every time that light flashes, there's also a bubble coming out. As I turn the knob, now it's going to be roughly 5 seconds per bubble. And again, you'll see the light flash and you'll see a bubble come up out of the cup at the same time. So this becomes really handy in dialing in your carbon dose. If there's no power or power is removed from the unit, it stays closed. No matter how you turn it, obviously there's no power, no CO2 is being released. Okay. All right, so now I've added about half of the remaining blue tubing that came with the reactor to the inlet line, and this is just simply going to get placed into our tank. So the inlet is right there. Probably not the best place for it. I'm going to mess around with this in a little bit to make sure that the position is perfect. So I've located our CO2 tank in a pretty unfortunate spot. As I had mentioned previously, the power cable for the carbon doser is very short, so with it being plugged into our apex up here, I apologize for all this wire mess. This is all going to get moved around at some point once we upgrade the sump. But the cable is only so long, so I have to plug it in very close to the apex. It's the one with the blue dot on it, blue light. So this is where the CO2 canister will be located. Our reactor is over here, so I'm going to have to run this clear tubing up into our check valve over there. Check valve is attached. Again, these are just simple push fittings. So the tube from the CO2 goes through the check valve, through the clear tubing, through a second check valve, and into the reactor where there's a separate bubble counter on the reactor. So I apologize for jumping a little bit ahead here. As you can see, I have the calcium reactor in place and it seems to be running. It's not fully set up quite yet. I still have to get the dosing pump hooked up to actually add the effluent into the tank. But as of right now, I just have it set up where the pH is pegged to 4.5 and it should stay right there because of the way that the apex is set up. So in the last part of the video, I showed you how to add the pH probe to your apex and get it set up to the carbon doser. So as I said before, the carbon doser is plugged into number 4 on our apex. It comes down to here. It's currently off. And it is off because the pH probe in the top is reading at 6.5. If that number is to raise above the 6.55 that we had set, then the doser will be turned back on until it hits 6.45, at which point it will turn it off. So figuring out how to put this all together was a little bit complex. I haven't seen too many videos of the actual setup of one of these, and the instructions in the box are non-existent. So basically, in order to get this running properly, as I had showed you, we plugged the CO2 in to the check valve. So this line is now fully attached. In order to get this running, all I did was run the inlet line into the tank. I opened this valve and then made sure everything was tight and sealed. And then the most important part was actually closing this ball valve. If you try to turn the calcium reactor on with that ball valve open, it's just going to be sucking air from the chamber through the tubing, and what's going to happen is the pump controller is actually just going to start flashing and basically say there's no water, it's not going to run. Every 5 minutes or so, it will try turning back on and it will attempt pumping water, but it's not going to be able to pump any water from the tank through the inlet unless this ball valve is closed. Once you close the ball valve, you should be able to turn the pump on, in which it will pump water from the tank into the reactor. At this point, I would recommend turning off your auto top-off system because any water that's pumped out is going to end up getting replaced by the auto top-off and it's going to lower your salinity. So how I actually ended up doing this is once everything was closed, I filled the reactor pretty much up to here with water. And the difficult part was actually realizing that this had to be closed in order for it to pump water and fill itself. It's also very important that once water is running into this pipe, so you fill it up, close the ball valve, water's going to get pumped in. Once water starts recirculating down this tube, it's going to flow from the reactor into this tube. Once that happens, you need to open the ball valve because at that point, water is starting to recirculate through the pump. If you don't open that, you're either going to be shooting water out through your output, which I have just in a bucket here. It's currently closed off. The other issue that I had not reopening this valve is water actually started to leak out the top, even with the super tight O-ring seal. So once I realized that, I opened the valve and the leak immediately stopped. I was able to wipe up all the water, tighten the lid a little bit more, and I haven't had any issues with it leaking since. So again, as of right now, water is just recirculating through the skimmer. The CO2 is not going in because the pH is at the right point. So it's just going to stay and continue to circulate for a little while. We want to see that the water inside the reactor clear out before we start adding any of it to the tank. So again, water will come in through this input line, go to the front of the pump, and then start circulating through our reactor. Okay, so just a quick recap of what we've done so far. We've got the calcium reactor in place, we've got it full of water, and it is running. I've got my inlet tube moved to the back, and I have my output effluent tube right next to it, just dripping in slowly. This is much slower than it will actually be running at, but right now it's just the first day, so I'm just seeing how well it's working so far. We've got the carbon doser. This is the part that's attached to our apex. This gets controlled by the pH probe that is in the top of the reactor. We've got our pump mounted on the wall, and that controls the Varios pump on the reactor. The only thing left to do is to add our continuous duty dosing pump to the effluent exit line, and I'm going to do that part tomorrow, but you guys are just going to see it in just a minute. Okay, so how all this is working is pretty simple. Water is getting pumped in through this blue inlet line. That goes down to the front of the reactor here. Kind of hard to see. There we go. The water then gets pumped through this pump and into the body of the reactor. The water then circulates through, falling back down through this tube, which goes back to the pump where it can be pumped in a continuous circle. At the back of this is where our CO2 goes in. So this is our CO2 line, and that runs all the way to our carbon doser, which we have right here. Again, this is what is being controlled by the apex. This goes on when the pH gets too high, and it goes off when the pH gets too low. Furthermore, as the water rises to the top, it comes out through this line here. This line I have just split at this little control piece. So this is like a ball valve or a gate valve. I believe it's called, the technical term is a needle valve. The water comes through here and then slowly goes through this tube to the output here. Now, it's probably not the greatest idea to have the input and the output at the same point, but it also probably won't be too big of an issue right now. As I said, I have to move a bunch of stuff, and I'm going to add the actual dosing pump tomorrow. Now, the dosing pump will give me a set flow rate from the reactor to the tank. Now, as long as the effluent, which is the liquid coming out of the reactor, remains a constant DKH and calcium level, then the dose will be pretty constant each day as well. So we can actually see that the carbon doser has turned back on, meaning the pH got slightly too high. So we can see the bubbles coming back out through the bubble counter. So that's just being dissolved into the water to bring the pH back down. So now we've gone through the setup for the calcium reactor. In our next video, we're going to give you an update on how this has been working on our display tank.
If you like our content, please like, subscribe, and ring the bell for notifications to join us on our journey through the sea.